as it always was, isn't it? The speculations just keep sending you back again. It's interesting how you can find comfort in any familiar Half-Life 2 mod, even a familiar horror mod. Wake up. It's time for the real review to begin. Nightmare House 2 2015 is the latest and greatest update of the already fantastic Half-Life 2 horror mod, Nightmare House 2. To any of you out there who aren't familiar with this mod, Nightmare House 2 was a single-player survival action horror mod created by We Create Stuff, directed by Hen Mazzolski, with the first version released in 2010. What's interesting the most for me about Nightmare House 2 is that this mod came out in the most opportune time when a bunch of indie horror games were starting to come out by the boatloads around this time. Games like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, Cry of Fear, SCP Containment Breach, Slender the 8 Pages, Afraid of Monsters, Director's Cut, and so on. Nightmare House and these other horror titles paved the way for this trend of horror games and pioneered the success of the big Let's Play YouTubers of today, such as your PewDiePies, your Markipliers, and so on.
Look at my horse is amazing. Give it a lick. I'm a stroke of its mane. It turns into a plane, and then it turns back again when you tug on its wing.
You know what they say, you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. So Nightmare House 2 actually begins with Nightmare House Prologue, which I will be treating as a separate game in and of itself. Why is that? Because technically the prologue is actually supposed to be Nightmare House 1. After all, Nightmare House actually started out as a simple horror map that Hen created back in 2005. Years later, Nightmare House was fully recreated into what we know now as the prologue and Nightmare House 2. If you go back and play the original inception of Nightmare House, you can see a lot of similarities and differences with it and the new Nightmare House. The prologue establishes the series of events that drive the story forward. This USG Ishimura, this Black Mesa incident of events. You play as a voiceless protagonist who crashes their truck against a tree at night and goes up to the abandoned house up yonder for any help whatsoever. You progress through the house knowing that, well, there's no help and everything is spooky, and, well, anyone with half a brain can figure that out. Now, one thing that I would like to point out before we move on is that right there. Look how the focal point is the top of the house, blackened as a silhouette in front of the moon, guiding the player towards it, wondering what horrors await them within the Nightmare House. Now this, ladies and Germans, is known as really good level design. Just wanted to get that out of my system, moving on. As you move through the house, you will encounter spooky zombies and monsters, jump scares, and this creepy woman here. Okay. This woman here is very important. This here is Emily. Emily is a focal point in the mod's plot, and she appears frequently throughout the prologue. As you progress through the house, story bits are hinted through apparitions and flashy, scary paranormal flashes, which the mod does a fairly decent job at doing. Gameplay-wise, the mod moves and feels like Half-Life 2, yet the weapons say otherwise. You have custom-made weapons and a new view model for these weapons, with fresh new sounds that play a lot differently than the vanilla Half-Life 2 weapons. The first weapon you receive is of course the melee weapon. You get the iconic Nightmare House axe that's useful for smacking zombies in the face to conserve your ammo. You later get a small 9mm pistol and a pump-action shotgun that does what you would normally expect from most shooters. And let us not forget our trusty 6-shooter sidearm.
Iron on his hip, big iron on his hip.
As a horror game, Nightmare House Prologue does get the scare out of you very, very well. Even for most hardcore gamers, Nightmare House can still bring chills to even the most seasoned of horror FPS fans. I know it did to me. Now, I'm not that easily freaked out by horror games, but Nightmare House Prologue sure does still induce me with the case of the spine tingles. While Nightmare House Prologue nails its ambience very well, it's still flawed at delivering a good scare. The game relies a lot on jump scares, as usual, for most of the time, and it gets really old very fast. Considering how the prologue is very short and very linear, the time in between jump scares are short, making the later jumps not as scary as the first ones. You will encounter Emily so many times that it just feels a little too jammed in for the most part. Now, while this is the case, the jump scares are still really good, sometimes dull and predictable, but good nevertheless. Overall, Nightmare House Prologue can be completed in around 15 minutes at max, and while it's short, it's still very rich with gameplay and pacing, and overall gives you a big creep on the neck. After completing the prologue, the game takes you straight into the first chapter, with an eerie introduction from a mysterious voice stating,
Wake up. It's time for the real nightmare to begin.
You wake up inside an abandoned hospital. Confused and scared, you progress through, discovering the secrets bestowed upon you, asking questions such as how you got here, what is going on, and what's the cause of it. You come across the suspicious yet reassuring face of Dr. Romero, who communicates and guides you through the demented void that is Never Lose Hope Hospital. Story-wise, the mod is really good at telling you its story. There is a ton of environmental storytelling through the mod. The story itself is pretty good and really interesting for a mod of this stature. While the premise may seem like B-movie horror, there is so much more within that grasps your entire attention from beginning to end. The mod has fantastic pacing, excellent continuity and progression, and the story is filled with events, twists, and turns that ceases to not surprise you in each chapter. Gameplay-wise, Nightmare House 2 is the same as the prologue, obviously, but greatly improves from it as the level design is much better, much more spacious than its claustrophobic counterpart, and has a greater variety in its set pieces. Shooting-wise, there is a new weapon added, being a UMP SMG that is given to the player in certain fast-paced sections of the mod, great for attacking multiple enemies in a tight area. One thing that I forgot to point out that this mod did differently than its last version was the crosshair. In Nightmare House 2 2015, they did this cool thing where the crosshair only appears when you are holding right-click, or when you are hovering over selectable or grabbable objects. This is really cool as it adds both more immersion and gives off the illusion of readying your weapon at an upcoming foe. When it comes to overall pacing and level design, the mod excels with flying colors as both an action horror mod and as a single-player FPS experience. Everything from the meticulous placement of health and ammo carefully placed with surgical precision to the well-crafted lighting, jump scares, and geometric placing for the mod's puzzles is done with fantastic and masterful execution. Aesthetically, both the prologue and Nightmare House 2 look and feel truly dark. The prologue captures that haunted house feel very well, and Never Lose Hope Hospital both looks, sounds, and feels like an otherworldly place. Nightmare House 2 has some of the best lighting, if not the best lighting for a horror game I have ever seen, with lighting being done at almost the professional level of quality. Everything to letting the player know where to go through focal points and places of attention, to giving the look of a truly scary and ghostly hospital, to setting off a specific mood is just almost too close of being artistic. The mod uses a ton of custom textures and models, both high-end quality and resolution, using the right colors to give off the right atmosphere. Much of the sounds in the mod are a combination of great custom sounds and sounds from Half-Life 2, with sounds such as creaking metal, squeaky walls and boards, unsettling air, and so much more. Nightmare House 2 has a massive OST packed with around 40 plus songs, each unique with their own respective purpose, fantastically composed to give off the right emotion. Nightmare House 2 is one of the few mods that I have played that has both one of the creepiest ambient pieces mixed with bassy and synthy melodies for specific sections of the mod. You have a track for everything and anything, and the mod presents a new track for every chapter. Now, I may have said so many good things about this mod, heck, maybe too many good things, but now it's time to look at the flaws of this mod. To be honest, I had a really hard time finding the flaws to this mod, as there are very few flaws, with any arguably being subjective. Now, there is one common complaint about this mod that a lot of people who have played this has stated. It's brought up anytime someone has to say something negative about it, and I guess I have to be the man doing it because, well, I am the mod reviewer. Also, this part's going to have spoilers. So, yeah. One common complaint that people bring up about Nightmare House 2 is that it's too much like Fear. You know, Fear, First Encounter, Assault Recall. Yeah, that Fear. The critically acclaimed 2005 action horror first-person shooter from Monolith Productions that is seemingly one of the greatest FPS and horror games of all time. Nightmare House 2 takes so much from Fear that it's easy for one to mistake the game as a Fear clone at times. Both games involve a creepy ghost girl. Both involve paranormal and supernatural, even psychological themes. Both have spooky bloody skeletons. Both have a shady male persona that has a connection with the creepy ghost girl. Both have SWAT-looking guys that are on your side. And both even have similar scripted sequences. Nightmare House 2 has a nightmarish long corridor section with blood leaking from the ceiling just like Fear? Check. Nightmare House 2 has a corridor on fire with said creepy ghost girl with the fire coming closer to you with only you trying to get away from it? Check. At least there's no obnoxious fat redheaded guy leaving empty bags of cheese puffs everywhere, or else Nightmare House 2 might as well be inspired by John Woo action films and Japanese horror flicks. Now I'm just going to go on the defensive and say that yes, Nightmare House 2 is heavily inspired by Fear, but does it make it a Fear clone? Of course not. Heck, I'd even go as far to say that Nightmare House 2 is a better game than Fear in certain cases. Fear was never that much of a scary game, for me at least. Yes, it was creepy and captured the horror element very well, but was not as close to being as frightening as Nightmare House 2, in my opinion. Fear is heavily action-orientated, and while Nightmare House 2 does have action-heavy sequences, it feels more like a survival horror compared to Fear. It's slower, more deliberative, it doesn't toss you enemies at you constantly, you don't have freak of nature slow-mo skills, aren't tossing grenades everywhere, and are very vulnerable for most of the game. And you have to manage your resources and take note of what's happening. Saying Nightmare House 2 is a straight-up clone of Fear is like saying that the new Doom is just Halo but with gore. Okay, had to get that out of me. Well, looks like a lot has been said about Nightmare House 2 2015, but before we continue, how long is this mod? I can safely say that this mod is approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes to 2 hours or more, depending on how fast you play. A great amount of time for a free, well-made, well-crafted Half-Life 2 mod. Now before I give this mod its final rating, I need to state something. I was going to actually go through the original version of Nightmare House 2 to compare the changes, but I was not able to get the mod to even launch, so I'm just going to sum up all the differences here in this one list. Score time! In conclusion, if I were to base this game off my special 4-seal rating system of either green, yellow, orange, or red, I give Nightmare House 2 2015 by We Create Stuff. You guys probably already know my answer. A green seal, certified swanky dank by yours truly. Nightmare House 2 is that kind of mod that must be played by Half-Life fans and horror fans alike, and I highly recommend it to everyone. Hen7, also known as Hen Mazolski, if you are watching this, I wish to say to you, Shalom, and to have a good one. You and everyone at We Create Stuff have created a masterpiece of a mod, and I hope that you guys' latest project, Underhell, goes out very well and makes it soon onto Steam. My name is Nutritious Bag Circles, and this has been a review of Nightmare House 2 2015.